Welcome to the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society for what promises to be a very interesting and timely conversation of Brazil, looking ahead to 2014. We have most of the Council of the Americas is today somewhere in Latin America, whether it be Peru, Paraguay, San Jose, Costa Rica, various other places. So it falls to me to have the privilege and the honor to host the program this morning. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I'm the Vice President of the Council. And for those of you who don't get down to Washington, we probably haven't seen each other, but I head the Washington office of the Council. And it is a real privilege to be here. It's also quite fun to be out of Washington these days, which is always a rather complicated environment. But it is a great privilege to welcome all of you. In particular, to welcome the Acting Consul General of Brazil here in New York, Vladimir Faller Filho. To have you, sir, and all of the rest of you who have chosen to make today part of your agenda. Brazil for 2014 is a question mark. We've seen the country rise. We've seen the country do some very interesting and very positive things. We've seen the country become now the 6th largest economy in the world. Obviously, it remains by far the largest economy in Latin America. We've seen a new political model instituted democratically, which is fiscally responsible, but also emphasizes social development and poverty alleviation, and things that people have talked about for many years, but are now being implemented. But at the same time, we've seen a global economy that's slowing, particularly China. Europe and the United States and North America remain sluggish in our growth. We've seen a country that perhaps is struggling a little bit in terms of infrastructure, even as the country prepares to welcome the world for the World Cup this coming year. We've seen some protests, and we are aware of an election that's coming up this coming year. So there are some interesting and open questions. A country that, broadly speaking, in my personal view, is on the right track, doing some very interesting, very smart things, but has some near-term challenges. It has to be said. And so we want to explore some of these things. From the political and economic side this morning, the implications are directly important, obviously, for the people of Brazil, but they're also important for the people of Latin America. Brazil, in many ways, being an engine of regional growth, and also important, it must be said, for the rest of the world. We are very fortunate to have with us this morning 3 true experts on the topic. I don't think you'll find better, more capable speakers than the ones that we have here with us this morning. They're going to discuss these important questions from the political, from the economic, and from the broader business perspectives. From Prospectiva Consulting in Brazil, we have Ricardo Sennes and also Davis Hodge. You have their bios, I believe, with you, or you have access to them, so I won't take the time to go into their very impressive backgrounds. I've actually hosted Ricardo and some of his colleagues in Washington in the past. When I had the privilege to host him last time, I actually said in the group that he was, in my view, probably the most handsome man in the entire audience. The fact of the matter is, I know that New York audiences are much better looking than Washington. I get that. Still, I think he's probably the most handsome man in the room. So, yeah. But, and Davis, don't take it personally. I know you guys work together. The third speaker, now that I'm trying to work myself quickly out of a hole, is Lisa Schineller. Lisa is well known to all of us here at the Council. She's a frequent guest and speaker with us, and we are delighted to have her as well. She's, of course, with Standard & Poor's. Each of them is going to make a presentation of a few brief minutes to set the table, and then I will likely have a couple questions to engage in terms of starting the conversation, and then we'll go to all of you. As you can tell by all of the cameras and the audio recording devices around the room, this is on the record conversation, and we hope and anticipate that those of you, if you at least are looking at Twitter this morning, you are at least tweeting about this program itself and encouraging all of your colleagues to tune in as well. Why don't you join me, please, in welcoming as our first speaker, Ricardo Sennes from Prospectiva Consulting.
Thank you, Eric, for your kind introduction. I thank the Council for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to meet with you and discuss Brazil with you. I think as Eric mentioned, it's not easy to understand the way Brazil is managing its growth. I think the challenger here is to try to understand what's the logic we have in Brazil behind the craziness that sometimes the country show. I brought some slides in order to support my arguments. I would try to give you three major hypotheses about the Brazilian way of growth. So I will be very quickly in presenting these slides, but I think the focus is stress these three hypotheses about the Brazilian model. This would be the three hypotheses. The first one is about Brazilian political fragmentation. I think we have to pay attention about this issue because they affect a lot the business environment in Brazil as a whole. The second would be try to give some facts and also try to present a model of the Dilma's administration. And finally, give you some data about the next election, next year, and also try to give, I think, one single hypothesis about the strategy of the Labour Party, the PT, for the next election, that would be the crucial element for the next election. So to be very fair with you, I will leave this. I think we have this in the site for the Council because it's a very complicated issue, but I will make this very easy. The point here is to understand the Brazilian political system and mainly the way the decision-making process in Brazil is made. We have to consider all these elements about the Brazilian political system. We have a very strong federalism. That means that not just the federal government matter, but also the state level and also the municipalities. The three of these levels are part of the Brazilian federalism. Secondly, we have a multi-party system. That means combining with a very strong federalism, we have a multi-partisan system that operates in a very complicated way, a complex way. I would say this one of the part of the Brazilian system that represents a lot the way the Brazilian political systems overrepresented the minorities in the country. This is, I think, is very interesting. Because all the political system has an overrepresentation of the minorities. That's why the political decision-making process is so complicated. So it's not a lack of democracy, but sometimes it's a way to organize the Brazilian democracy that make this. The third element that's part of consequence of this is what we call in Brazil the Brazilian coalition system. That means in order to the president to make decisions, to implement policies, they do need a broad coalition, really broad coalition. Not just mention the parliament, but also including other political forces, interest groups. It's, again, a very complicated decision-making that makes the Brazilian presidentialism different from the other Latin American countries. A very, I think the precisely definition of president coalition system. The third, I would be about the provisional measure that was another feature of the Brazilian decision-making process. I will not mention this, but this just that represents the way that a weak president used to foster decisions in the Congress. That I think the best way to understand the provisional measures is a way to link a weak presidency with a very strong Congress. The third is about the 50 budget policy rules in Brazil. We have to take in account that in Brazil, to implement the budget, the budget that is approved by the Congress, it's a permanent bargaining process between the legislative and the Congress. It's a kind of process that does not define in the previous year what will be done in the next, but just is a part of the decision-make process in terms of how the budget will be implemented. So it's another element. I will not go in of these topics, but just to give you an idea about how complex it is to coordinate, to manage the majority in the Brazilian political system, the majority that will allow the president to make decisions and to define policy and implement policies. And finally, the broader and detailed constitution, that is another completed issue about Brazil. So this is, just to give some data, this is how the Brazilian parliament is divided, the number of political parties. Look, pay attention that the Labour Party, the PT, is just 20% of the Brazilian Congress. That is, as we are discussing with Lisa, is PT in Brazil is not the majority of the society. So PT, as I will try to explain, has a very smart and clever strategy to be the leader of this broader coalition that's running Brazil for the last 10 years. But it's not the majority of society. This is important to keep in mind. So the biggest political force in Brazil is the PMDB. This is very central political party, very well connected with different regions in the country, and they is in charge, the PMDB is the party who really control the Congress. This is very important, and again, to keep in mind. Just to give another example about the Brazilian political fragmentation. This is how the state governors, how the political parties is divided in the country in terms who is in charge of the state governors. If you take the gray areas, the gray area represents the states under control of the PSDB, the opposition part. They are the key element when you take the state level political disputes. That includes the most important states like São Paulo, like Minas. That's why PT, that is the violet here, no, violet, the red. The PT controls 4 small, not small, but it's not a secondary state. So when you take the PT as the state level, they are not the majority, even the most important political force. Look, the opposition part, the PSDB, is much more important than PT in the state level. If we go deep, this is about the mayors in Brazil, divided by parties. It's even more fragmented. You can see how many municipalities it's under control of the other political parties. PT is the 3rd biggest in terms of controlling municipalities in Brazil. This is, I think, represents quite well how the political fragmentation in Brazil is a fact. That's nothing to do. This put Brazil in a completely different track when you compare with Argentina or Venezuela. So that's why it's so, for us, so wrong to try to compare what's going on in Brazil with other countries in Latin America in that sense. So there is no political polarization in Brazil. When you think about PT, the Lulas and Dilma, we are not talking about polarization as we have in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador. Let's think in different way. So, secondly, presidents and state governors need broad coalitions in order to design and implement public policy. So that's why when you take public policy in Brazil, we should not think about public policy as the unique decision of the presidency or the state governor. We need to understand that public policy in Brazil is a result of the big coalitions that is necessary to make decisions in the Brazilian political system. Third, PT has a strategy focused on presidency rather than controlling the whole political system. When Lula and his main assistant decided in 2000 that this would be the strategy of the PT, concentrate all the strategic political capacity of PT to control the presidency. That means that they will put to the negotiation for the other political parties the control of the other level of the political system in Brazil, mainly the state level and the Congress. So this, I think, is important. The PT is the leader of the coalition who controls the federal executive branch. Labour Party, PT, is not controlling the whole system. Opposition is not organized in a single political group. This is important. This is something for the PT strategy. It's quite good news. That means the opposition is not concentrated in a single group. That means the PT and the PMDB, the major allied of PT, they are not facing an organized opposition. That means the opposition is also fragmented. Oh, let's keep this in mind to discuss the other topics. So about Dilma. This graphic shows the recent history of Dilma's evaluation of Brazilian population. So when you take, sorry, I think the numbers is not very clear there. So, but the topic, it's 63% in the red line. That means that the approve of the Dilma's administration in the first 2 years of her term, it's very, very high. Even when you compare with Lula term, Fernando Henrique Cardoso term, they're completely above of the average of approval in terms of in the presidency. Something happened in June after the protests, but the protest, even though has reduced the level of approval of Dilma, they not broke the perception of the population that Dilma continue to have a quite good government, quite good administration. If you put together the red line, that's a great and good perception, with the yellow one, that means regular performance, we continue to have a great majority of the Brazilian population supporting Dilma administration. So you are talking about something like 73% of the Brazilian population supporting her, even after the protest of the June. So again, this is something important. The protests in Brazil, of course, was important. They gave some signs. They gave some signs about some interest groups, mainly in the big cities, in the from the middle class, that they're not very comfortable with the situation, but these do not represent what the majority of the perception of Brazilian population about the federal government. This is given an important data about what the Brazilian population is perceiving as the worst problem in the Brazilian public agenda. Look how interesting. Healthcare is in the top of the list. That means after this Brazilian growth, is not anymore inflation, employment, this kind of issue that is in the top of the list, but something related to public policy, health. And for my surprise, the third topic is taxes. I cannot explain you why, but there is an important topic. Besides this, look, in the gray area here, we have the coalition that's supporting Dilma, both in the Senate and the lower house. That means in the both parliament house, Dilma has the support, the formal support, as we see, is not the real one, the formal support of 75% of the Senate and the Parliament, and the House of Representatives. But when you take the second graph is something that in Brazil we call the coalition loyalty index. That means what will be the percentage of votes that this coalition, the formal coalition, is really given for the federal government, for the presidency. That means you take all the measures of the bills that the presidency presents to the Congress, and you measure how much the coalition is supporting or not the president's bills. And what we see is Dilma is facing a reduction in terms of the loyalty of her coalition, the political support in the Congress. Something that is risky in terms of stability, I would say no. It's something that Dilma understood. That's why Dilma asked Lula to come back to the stage and taken control about the negotiations of from PT and the coalitions, that the political parties that make the coalitions. And Lula is back on the stage for the last, I think the last 3 or 4 months, and probably this index will start to grow again because Lula is the one who is behind the Dilma doing all the connecting these dots in terms of coalition in the federal government. Just to give you very briefly numbers about the Dilma's performance in terms of economics, I took the economic forecast graph comes from the Itaú Bank. It's a very important bank in Brazil. It's nothing to do with the vision. The bank do not have the same vision of the presidency. So it is a neoclassic vision about macroeconomic projections. So look how stable is the projection from this guy. So if you take the first line, it's about the debt, the fiscal balance. You can see an increase, a slow increasing in terms of fiscal debt, but nothing to do with a rupture or a crisis in this sense. Even when you take the inflation, that's EPCA, it's the index, inflation index in Brazil that you use. That EPCA is this orange line. So even this bank is taking the inflation as how more or less under control. That is, I think, is important. The way just to give another numbers, the table that you have in the bottom, it's a combination of 4 different forecasts. We take focus from the Brazilian Central Bank, Itaú, again, this private banking, LCA, that is a more heterodox economic consultant firm, just to take a different vision about the Brazilian macroeconomic process, and finally IMF. Look, all of them is indicating that the forecast for Brazilian economy is a slow growth. Nobody there is supposing that Brazil is about to face a crisis. Nobody there is supposing that Brazil is about to have a Chinese growth rate in the near future. All of them is thinking about something around 3% in terms of GDP growth. So that means, again, something is going on in Brazil in which all the dispute in the political system is not directly affecting the way the economy is performing. So another crucial number, and this is really a crucial number as we are talking with Lisa, that is the graph about investment rate in Brazil. This is disaster in Brazil. This forecast is made by the Brazilian Development Bank. They usually to make wrong projections about the growth of investment rate in Brazil, and this is the key element. The economic growth in Brazil is not supported by increasing in investment. They much more based on increasing in consumption. Just I will mention just one graph here. That is this biggest one. If you take the gray area, this presents the growth in terms of the federal budget in Brazil. Look, in 5 years, we almost double the federal budget in the country. This is important because, this, as we know, the state in Brazil is very important economic actor, player. When the government decides to influence, to interfere in some areas of the economy, they can make a difference in that sense. And I think this is a topic that Davis will raise with you. Another, just to give again some facts about the Brazilian economy, the first graph, the BNDES, the National Development Bank in Brazil. Look how important is the presence of this bank. We are talking about billion reais. If you divide by 2, it's more or less billion of dollars. So we start 2007 with something like $34 billion per year as a spending in the bank. And we have, after 5 years, 3 times this amount. So this is again, very illustrative how the Brazilian state agents is gaining so many capacity to make investments, offer credits, and whatever in terms of economic support for activities. And the second graph is about the growth of Petrobras, the oil state company of Brazil. As you can see, they have a huge investment program. If you take this number, this year, the projection is 94 billion in terms of reais. That's something like $50 billion as investment, a single state company. As a conclusion, Dilma has, I think, 3 basic axes that support her government. First, heterodox macroeconomic management. That means it's not no macroeconomic management. It's not to do with a crazy management, macroeconomic management. It's just a heterodox one. We have to expect, when you make the projection about Brazil, that the guys who is managing the macroeconomics in Brazil, they are Keynesian guys. Just take the PhD thesis of these people. All of them is managing Keynesian theories about how to manage currency, how to manage investment, whatever. So we have to project in Brazil a Keynesian approach about a macroeconomic management. As Lisa mentioned, the point here is they go to the limit in terms of this approach. This is true. I think it's important. It's not a moderate Keynesian guy. They try to go to the limit, test the limit, but when they reach the limit, as we have this year in terms of inflation, when they perceive that the inflation is really dangerous in terms of losing control, they make a very conservative measure that was increase the interest rate in a way that nobody was expecting in order to reduce inflation. So we can continue to project something in this frame. Second, the second axis of Dilma, that's something related, similar to Lula, it's a strong industrial policy and economic incentives, mainly through the state companies, banks, and agencies. And we do have a lot of bank agents and company agencies and bank state-owned state-owned companies, banks, and agencies. About 235 the federal government has in terms of tools to operate in the economy. And finally, we have the third axis, that's social policy focus in income distribution. This is something that makes Dilma a little bit different from Lula. Lula was focused on this kind of social programs, but also focused on education and health and other areas. Dilma seems to have put these other issues aside and they stress the idea of income distribution programs. So this is it's not just Bolsa Família, it's a group of different programs, but they are very much focused on this stuff. When you take the numbers about other social policies, it's not that good, with exception probably the education, that all the indicators has presented a quite interesting improvement. The other social policy is not that good, because part of this is related to the focus that Dilma has on social policy, very much focused on income distribution. Finally, to give quickly some data about the elections, we have 5 potential candidates. Actually, in the end, by about March the next year, we will have just 3 of them, because Aécio Neves and José Serra, they come from the same party. Currently, we are expecting that Aécio Neves will be the candidate, but Serra probably will be will be fighting until March to be the candidate. So this, I think, the scenario about PSDB is not completely defined. And secondly, Marina and Eduardo Campos, they have made recently a coalition. They are now in the same party, the Brazilian Socialist Party. But again, they're not fully decided who will be in charge of the candidate for PSB. Probably will be Eduardo, but there are some scenarios in which Marina could be in charge of this. And finally, Dilma. Look, this is the vote intentions. The red line is from Dilma.
she reduced the approval of her government, and the approval of her government have affected the vote intentions on her, but she continues to be in a quite good position when you compare with the others. You should consider that Marina, that's the yellow line in the graph, Marina is probably out of this election. As I said, she is in a coalition with Eduardo Campos. So if you take Marina out of this graph, you can see how isolated Dilma will stay in this scenario. When you take the most probable scenario for elections, is the second one. That means Dilma will face Aécio Neves and Eduardo Campos. In this scenario, that is the most recent scenario that we have, the most recent pool that we have, Dilma is, in this scenario, can win in the first turn of the election, first round of the election. The scenario in which Dilma will face, I think, the most strong opposition will be with Marina. Look at the scenario 1. Just to give some ideas about how deep is the Dilma support. When I mention Dilma, we have to remember that Dilma is in a coalition. Let me present this. This is the PT coalition. Look, we are talking about 11 political parties together with PT. Again, PT is not the majority of the Congress or even the state governors or even the mayors, but PT is leading the political coalition for the federal government. Compare the size of the coalition of PT with the size of coalition of PSDB, PSB, and the others. I think this is a critical difference from the strategy, the Labour Party strategy comparing with the others. The others do not have a broad coalition in order to really face the majority coalition led by PT. So, but just to present some numbers about this, the spontaneous response by regions, I think the most important information from this data is Dilma and Lula are the first and second options for the population. When you ask them, in your perception, who will be the best next president? So the PT is the first and the second. This I think tells us something very deep in the Brazilian society. Other aspect, Dilma win the others candidate in all regions in the country. Even though Eduardo Campos is very strong in Northeast, even though Aécio Neves is very strong in Minas Gerais, the state in the central Brazil, Dilma continues to have a best performance in all regions in the country. When you take the income in Brazil, again, Dilma wins in all income segment of the Brazilian society. Of course, she has 63% of support of the lowest level of the Brazilian. And after this, 49 for the second level, but she also have a 1/3 of the support from the A and B social class in Brazil. So sometimes we cannot compare this profile with the profile of Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales. It's completely different. Dilma has 1/3 of the A, B classes, 2/3, 50% when you go to the middle class, and 2/3 of the support when you go to the lower class. Again, the distribution, if you cross this with the regions, you see that 2 regions combine very well the low level, the low social class with some areas like Northeast. In that area, I think Dilma is in the best performance, but we are not going that deep. This presents scenarios for the runoff. That's the second turn of the election. Dilma, in all scenarios, win. But again, Marina will be the candidate who will offer Dilma the most complicated second term. But anyway, it's important to, and I will give this data just to present you how interesting is the Brazilian political fragmentation. When you take São Paulo state scenario, the current government is Geraldo Alckmin from PSDB, the most important political party from the opposition. Look, we have in the state of São Paulo a similar scenario for PSDB that we have for the federal level for PT. In the state of São Paulo, the most important economic and political state in Brazil, the PSDB has been in power for the last 24 years. This guy is for third time the governor of São Paulo. And he is in the best position to be re-elected again. So this guy, if you take for the São Paulo state, the same scenario of PT for the federal level, we will find similar features. The most important political coalition in the state of São Paulo is managed by PSDB. PT has a coalition, but not so broad as the PSDB. When you take the performance in terms of social class, the PSDB is quite similar. So that's interesting, how the fragmentation in the Brazilian political system has to be analyzed separately from the federal level, from different state levels. And take the second more important state in São Paulo, in Brazil, that's Rio de Janeiro, and you can see that a scenario in which the Labour Party is the third in the list of intention votes. This is Lindenberg Faria. They are managed by basically for Antonio Garotinho, who is a guy, a former PMDB guy. But again, just to present how complicated it is when you take different scenarios and try to understand the whole picture. It's not easy, but the way to understand this is all of them need broad coalitions to really be able to be elected and produce public policy and implement public policy. So I think this is basically the topics that I would to raise with you in terms of scenarios, just to stress the idea that to make decisions and to implement decisions in Brazil in the way that the Brazilian political system is designed is very complicated. We are not talking about one guy, one person. We are talking about a huge amount of interest groups that only in that way they will be able to implement. That means that it's not easy to change the policies in Brazil. As we were talking with Diogo before, you're not expecting changes in health policies. No, even though the opposition will be elected, we cannot expect ruptures in public policy in Brazil. Macroeconomic and industrial policies. In Brazil, we have an incremental public policy. That means because the coalitions move like that. It's different from the majority systems like UK and other political system. And when you have a government elected, this government controls the whole decision-making process. And they can change a lot in suddenly public policy. In Brazil, we move like big whales. So the movement is like an incremental one. So I think this is an important element to think about scenarios in Brazil, and finally to combine this political system feature with the economy projections. That's why all the economic institutions in Brazil make projections in terms of economic performance with no big change. There is no sharp change. You are expecting to have this kind of movement in terms of economic growth. So I think this is my provocative hypothesis, and I hope we have good questions to debate afterwards. Thank you.
I think we all just got a master's degree in Brazilian politics. Ricardo, thank you very much. That was really well done. So many things I'd like to follow up with. Let's go to Lisa actually next, but just as she's preparing to go, I'd love for you to come back in a year or less, and a week is an eternity in politics, much less a year. And it would be fascinating to see in the Brazilian context how some of these scenarios have changed over the coming year with some of the party congresses, some of the economic scenarios, maybe some black swan crises that we can't predict, obviously the World Cup and the performance and all that. It would be fascinating to see if the analysis that you've put up there holds up under, I mean, predictions are impossible always, but just to see how well they've held up over time. Yeah, good, interesting. Lisa, let's go to you.
Great.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Eric. It's a pleasure being on the panel. I'm going to just go quickly through some slides, slower than others, kind of just talk a little bit about the macro picture, and then obviously touch on the rating, which is of interest to many. A lot of news stories, in particular, most recently, about Brazil's sovereign rating. From the macro perspective, I think key points that I would want to just highlight on the onset. Here's our picture for Latin America in general, which is a story of slower growth moving forward than we've seen in the recent past. And that's exactly the same for the case of Brazil. If you look at how the region's growth averaged in the pre-global crisis recession period, 2004 to 2008, growth averaged a little over 5% per year on average. And then so take out the dip and then the rebound across the region from 2011, our projections through 2015, we have growth of only a little over 3%, 3.2%, okay? The Brazil numbers for this picture are growth of almost 5% in the 2004-2008 period of 4.8%, but growth of only 2.3% from 2011 to 2015. And that's disappointing. And the reasons why the region, and in Brazil in particular, are growing, and we expect to grow at a more subdued rate for the case of Brazil, are a combination of structural, cyclical, external, and domestic. And that's where I would say from the external picture, clearly pre-global recession, China's growing way over 10% per year. You had advanced economies growing strongly, and a lot of global liquidity. Things change. China's still growing strongly, but that has continued to edge down. And we see growth in China in the 7.5 range. That's a big difference. That's going to impact globally, LATAM, but also Brazil. In addition, the external market climate has certainly changed. Immediately with the global financial crisis, you had extraordinary monetary policy stimulus in place from the advanced economies and creating a major search for yield and a lot of liquidity, and somewhat, you could then say this could lead to some complacency by both the market as well as by policymakers, and that's changing. The whole tapering, the shift to tapering by the Fed, be it in December, be it next year, when that was raised early in May, surely has changed the market and the volatility in the market and where bond yields are across the region and in Brazil and the way currencies have. So there's an important change in the global backdrop. But I would say, taking on one of the points that Ricardo has highlighted, we think that the global political dynamics do make a difference as well. And the increased volatility, unevenness in macro policy in Brazil with deterioration on the margin feeds into a more subdued growth environment moving forward. No rupture. I think that's an important part. Brazil is investment grade. Okay? It's 2 notches inside of investment grade. And we're seeing deterioration around the trend. And the numbers will highlight, we see some deterioration that we think may continue. Hence, we have a negative outlook. But if you still look at key underpinnings for its rating, for the strength of the economy, it's still it's night and day from where it was a decade ago. So kind of big picture, some deterioration, but important strengths still remain in place. So I think that's kind of the top line message would want to give. So moving from this graph, which is kind of the region, here you can see in the red bar show quarterly GDP growth in Brazil going from 2010 to where we are now. Is pretty strong deceleration. And that feeds into a lot of market disappointment. Now, we would never think that growth in Brazil could be even, you know, on in an annual basis, it was in 2010, 7.5%. That's way above Brazil's potential. Would put potential growth in Brazil closer to the 3, maybe 3.5 range. It's growing below potential at the moment. Okay, from a medium-term perspective, it's long-term average is growth of around 3.5%. Okay, so it's more recently underperforming that somewhat even low number for an emerging market. So that has to do with, again, a combination of external and domestic factors. Any way you slice it, all activity indicators have come down in the recent years. Over red line is all Brazil, and I have some Mexico numbers on there, but kind of sharp deceleration with some comeback. And that's where we do have growth coming up this year relative to last year on kind of, you're thinking of, kind of on a shorter term basis. But below, activity levels remaining below where they were, okay? Industrial production, same story, significant strength, then, contraction and some comeback. Retail sales, again here the consumer is a key driver of the Brazilian economy. The consumer has also notched down in terms of its pace, where we have retail sales that were growing close to the 10% range, now kind of moving closer to the 5% range. That's an important contributor to slower growth in Brazil. And obviously on the export side, here I'm saying also switching this domestic contributors to growth slower, but also on the external side, strong deceleration in the performance of exports, some pickup, but more moderation relative to what you had in prior years. So the global backdrop's different. Let me flip here for a second in terms of global market volatility. These bars basically show changes in bond yields for key countries. The left chart, currencies on the right-hand side for key countries in the region. Deterioration across the board since earlier this year in terms of you've got spreads in bond yields, several hundred basis points higher today than they were at their strongest position in 2013. This is all post-tapering. And even the postponement of tapering, which is the green bar, so kind of the blue and the red are kind of pre- and post the September announcement. The green bar is kind of more recently, the end of October. Bottom line is, it's not like we're back to where we were earlier in the year, and we don't expect that to be the case. Currency's weaker, the real's going to be weaker, bond yields wider. Global backdrop has changed. In addition, you have Brazil in a monetary policy tightening mode, so that's also feeding into lower growth, okay? Kind of the strength in the sense of you have flexibility in monetary policy. For the first time ever in 2009, Brazil was able to cut interest rates in the midst of a crisis, as many of its colleagues were in LATAM too, the strength of improvements across the region. But you had significant reductions in interest rates on the order of 500 basis points, but then that's come back, kind of going up. And then as the economy really slowed, started to see signs of slowing 2011 with the European crisis, then coming in kind of reduction in rates. But then since earlier this year, they've been going up, and they're up it's over 200 basis points this year. We expect a little bit more. That is going to feed into some, from a cyclical perspective, lower growth also next year. And Brazil is the top, is the top line in the chart there. In the midst of this, in this sort of here, kind of the global backdrop, volatility in capital flows. That's something that we will expect to continue throughout LATAM and for Brazil. Okay, as we move into a different world where rates in the U.S. will be going up, and the attractiveness, therefore, of investing in the U.S. relative to some EM will also change. We're not seeing, obviously, loosening, any tightening of policy in Europe. Yesterday's announcement feeds into that, as well as what's happening in Asia. But in the advanced economies, the U.S. will move into a tightening mode. Therefore, we see more expensive capital externally that'll feed then therefore prices in local markets, which you've already seen on the bond yields. But volatility here. And I think in the midst of all the negative market sentiment about Brazil, I would like to highlight, and the some deterioration in the macro policy mix, you still have record inflow. You have strong inflows this year on portfolio flows, 36 billion year to date through September. And an important changing trend that has occurred over the past decade, picked up in the more recent years in particular, non-residents investing in local government paper, okay, so buying real-denominated bonds from Tesoro, that trend has actually continued through the tapering mode in hype this summer. Brazil is on the lower end. Into here, it's the blue bar, versus, say, Peru and Mexico in terms of penetration of non-residents in the local market. But the bottom line, that number has continued to tick up, even through the market volatility. And that is a testimony to some of the strengths in the Brazilian economy and for our opinion, for the sovereign credit rating. Again, here, highlighting some of those strengths, and then I'll end on some challenges. We'll be feeding right into Davis's point. But if we look at Brazil's external debt, external indebtedness, which was a key vulnerability as balance of payments crises impacted the economy in prior decades, top bars, external debt relative to the export base, still night and day from where it was at the beginning of the 2000s, okay? It's not improving, okay? So there's been a sort of a tapering off, using the tapering word, a stall in steady improvement there, okay? And yes, some countries in globally and in the region have negative, they're creditors, okay? So that's not the case here. But bottom line is still very strong, in line with its peers in the BBB category, important to keep in mind. Financing needs, so external financing, its current account deficit. Yes, the current account deficit in Brazil is widening, but it also has a large stock of international reserves to help finance that, among with other external financing needs. The financing needs are better than those of many of its peers, i.e. lower, and they're much lower than they were earlier in the decade, okay? Strengths are still there. This is despite the fact we have an important swing in the current account deficit. And we also expect leveling off of the accumulation of international reserves because the buoyant global backdrop that we've had is no longer in play. So it's kind of steadiness here, but not deterioration. Where we do see some deterioration is on the fiscal side, okay? Again, we're not back to the levels and the size of the deficits, the top bars, general government deficit, that we had at the beginning of the previous decade. So important to keep that perspective in mind. But yeah, there has been there's been an important moderation in the size of the primary surplus in recent years relative to the past. Not that Brazil must have the same primary effort today as it did in the past, but there's a question of one, it is lower. Is it could it be a little higher? Question mark. But also a lot of the credibility around what is the government targeting, and the fiscal temporary measures to meet a target have definitely played a role on weakening Brazil's fiscal credibility and questions about its commitment on the fiscal side. And our shift to a negative outlook feeds into what we expect in terms of probably continued fiscal deterioration and questions of the use of off-budget. And this is also an important point to highlight here. This excludes the off-budgetary use of BNDES and the way that has the transfer of funds to BNDES below the line, which could add, another between 1.5 to 2 percentage points to the deficit every year since 2008. That's an important point to also keep in mind. So there's been deterioration in this framework. Again, not back to kind of where we were before, but yes, the trend has been weakening. Debt going up moderately. Again, not a rupture. I think that's an important point. But yes, deterioration and interest burden, which had been declining, could actually potentially, we have it here holding fairly steady, but you think about where bond yields are going globally, there's more risk to the upside on kind of the interest cost of Brazil's debt, to more meaning going higher today than it was before, combined with where the cycle of monetary policy is. But again, important point, again, today, yes, debt moving a bit higher, not to where it was, but also the strength, the composition of Brazil's debt today is actually still much stronger than it was a decade ago. If you think of the share of fixed rate paper versus share of floating rate paper, the share of dollar-linked paper, all of these aspects, there are important, key legs there still. with a amount of deteriorating trend. I think moving into maybe some of the points that Davis would highlight, the challenges that Brazil faces in terms of competitiveness, that is a structural issue. You've seen an important appreciation of the exchange rate in real terms over the years. There's been some recent comeback, but it's still expensive. And then you shift to labor costs in Brazil, which have risen dramatically, especially, again, you would think there's some, some adjustment over time, but then the continued rapid increase, particularly since 2009, that's something that weighs on the competitiveness of the Brazilian economy and feeds into the ability, the cost of doing business. Those are challenges. Unemployment at very low rates, so that's in some sense a positive, feeding it near historic lows, feeding into domestic demand momentum, consumption momentum, but at historic lows is not that they can, how much lower can they go, and therefore a moderation we expect moving forward in the pace of consumption. And you've seen how the pace of retail sales kind of growth has notched down. Also contributing with that is the credit story. Brazil went from having less than 30% credit to GDP to over 50% credit to GDP, the red line here. The households are more indebted. You're not going to be getting growth from keep adding into that channel. So that's another reason why we would see growth moving lower relative to where it was, absent changes in policies, for example, that can get at some of Brazil's longer-standing competitiveness issues. And that goes to kind of what policies we may want to see from the next, this government and the next administration that can tackle some of these challenges.
Lisa, thank you, and you too added tremendously to our knowledge and to the conversation this morning, as you always do, so thank you for that. Also raised a lot of interesting points and questions, which I hope we have some time to get to in the Q&A. Davis, let's have you clean up here, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel quite honored to go after the two of you, both extremely good-looking people. And
Eric too.
He's not on my good list. Right? So, coming off of Ricardo's setting of the political table, and you were extremely detailed and rapid-fire coverage of the entire economic spectrum, I think I'm going to try and tie this back to what this means for multinationals operating in Brazil. I'm going to go over this quickly because I'm sure that people have a lot of questions. I don't want to take up the remainder of the time. But as Ricardo mentioned, we see a lot of Keynesian policies that the PT and especially Dilma have enacted, and they've been bought full in. And many of these policies, as we've just seen in Lisa's presentation, have run their course in terms of their policy effectiveness. So I'm going to take a brief refresher on industrial policy in Brazil and how that ties in with how multinationals are operating in the country, how we see that in our practice, and considerations and challenges that they have moving forward, knowing, as we're predicting, that there's not going to be a large change in the political landscape, and on top of that, these are very, as we say, it's been repeated several times, we don't expect a rupture. So we're going to go through here. Just a quick refresher over the recent industrial policy landscape in Brazil. You've got Fernando Henrique, whose main concern was to stabilize the economy. And following on that, Lula and Dilma enacted more of a development economics approach to industrial policies. In 2004, we had the PITSE, which was looking at bolstering the domestic sector in specific sectors, the domestic economy, pharma, semiconductors, capital goods, increasing Brazil's competitiveness, and not just to compete domestically against imports, but hopefully to be able to export products. And then in 2008, more or less in a response to the global financial crisis, we had the PDP, which was more or less starting to look more inward focused on the Brazilian market. And then we brings us to the focal point of Dilma's tenure in office, which is the Brasil Maior plan, which is, it kind of completes the circle that was started by the PDP, but we see unparalleled alignment among agencies to drive a coordinated industrial policy that I'll touch on. It has two main components: central planning, which maximum return on investment for infrastructure projects, tax incentives, and public finance for targeted sectors. And then we see a nationalist approach, BNDES financing for national champions that are selected by the government more or less, trade measures to reduce imports, preference margins, which are actually driving up prices, but as an incentive to localized production, and national content requirements for various industries. So not an appealing picture for multinationals looking to operate in Brazil, at least on the surface. So in a nutshell, I touched on it briefly, we see Brasil Maior as branded as harmonized public policies backed by strong state financing mechanisms to promote domestic production, innovation, and export sectors. That's what I think you would hear in the halls of any agency in Brasilia, whether it be the industry, science, technology, ministries, or fisheries. That's what they'll say. So in practice, though, if we had a glossary for Portuguese, and I still count myself as learning Portuguese, but when we hear innovation in Brasilia, what we're really talking about is localized production. That is really, if you understand that, you can cut through a lot of confusion around these policies. So we're looking at import substitution, and that's coming at the cost of more traditional investment in R&D, which you would expect for true innovation policies. So I touched on this slightly earlier, but Brasil Maior has become the defining characteristic of Dilma's entire government. We saw much, I think, as you could say, Bolsa Familia was important to the previous administration. So she doesn't really have a foreign policy to speak of if we think about it in that context. There's no real movement on free trade agreements or other areas. It's just an unwavering commitment to dovetailing the entire activity of the state around this as a development approach. For example, Lisa was talking about the consumer being more or less tapped out if we see the available credit. But an example of kind of even social programs folding in on themselves is the Minha Casa Melhor program, which got a lot of press in Brazil last month. What it is it's a state-funded credit line to recipients of the Minha Vida program, which is the public housing transfer program. But it's a credit card you get with subsidized credit to buy domestically produced goods to furnish your house with. But that also extends to things like tablets and smartphones. A handy policy tool in an election year, no doubt. But so just to see what the kind of policies we're looking at, and once again drawing this back to the activities of a multinational, you kind of wonder what your role is in this economy. So, setting that kind of table, talking about Brasil Maior and where we are and how we're not really expecting any large changes in this area, what's a multinational to do? We all know there are a lot of multinationals in Brazil, and there's more arriving every day, so what's really happening here? So multinationals are invited to participate in this program. It's encouraged, invited, it depends on how you're looking at it. To be considered a local Brazilian company, you need to establish a local subsidiary or join a JV. It's not China, it's not India. I think General Electric is a very large Brazilian company if you asked people in Brazil, or Ford is considered a domestic company. They've been in the market for a long time, and they have Brazilian management. And Brazil has always been and remains open to foreign investment. It's not a question of investment, it's about localized production. So if you are looking to invest in Brazil, there are ways that Brasil Maior can be seen as an incentive, but it necessarily requires changes in approach by multinationals. So there's several advantages multis can achieve from this. There's a first mover advantage. There's investment and grants, which we've touched on, FINEPI, BNDES. There are, what did you say, 235 funding agencies at the disposal of the government. And when we look at Brazil and the role of the state, you have a very large procurement market, the Buy Brazil Act. There are lots of incentives on that side as well. So that's, on the one hand, looking at participating within Brazil Maior. Let me take a quick step back and say that there are ways to operate in Brazil outside of it, but doing so can make an already difficult place to do business much more difficult. So first of all, you've got tax issues in Brazil. I'll just touch on these very quickly because most people know about them, and also I don't want to bore everyone. But so tax issues make imports cost prohibitive, so you've got to localize production anyway. A frequent question we hear from our clients is, what's the absolute minimum I can do to not be prejudiced by some of these policies? And many opportunities are linked to the government itself. The government is also a regulator and an investor and a financer, but it's also a huge procurement market. And the state is very disposed to using the leverage the outsized leverage that it has in the market to choose winners, to reward companies that are playing by the rules that it set out. And in some sectors, and I'm thinking about, if we think about our clients, healthcare, oil and gas, and infrastructure, almost all of a majority of the purchases are linked in some way to the state or requisitions. So in less regulated industries, you're going to be often, your competition is going to be within these programs. So they will be availing themselves of these incentives, which makes it even more difficult to compete. So all of these issues lead to a much more collaborative engagement with the government by multinationals who are looking to grow quickly in Brazil. So, but what has, and Lisa's statistics kind of laid this out, is if we look at what has this industrial policy actually done for Brazil. We saw the deindustrialization. The numbers were the relief was quite dramatic, and the lack of competitiveness as well. These are all well-hashed issues, and the current policy has not done anything. They're accelerating, so something is accelerating exacerbating these problems. Instead, we've seen a much more consolidated, less competitive market in many sectors. The skewed incentives for localized production have created a redundancy of capacity in order to produce things that are already available in the market, often at a higher cost than they would be if they were imported. So there's no market for the export of these products, rather than focusing on what Brazil might have as a comparative advantage to trade abroad. It's kind of a missed opportunity there. And in the case of oil and gas, we see the pre-salt issues. You could argue that these policies have actually handicapped Brazil's access to these natural resources because the technology needed Brazil doesn't have the capacity to develop the technology needed, and it's in a position now where it can't import it. So in the best opportunity, you're going to have a JV that will team up with, have a Brazilian partner, and those costs are necessarily going to be higher. And then finally, there haven't been very strict metrics on many of these programs, where the funding has gone, how it's been used, how it's been led to domestic production, and how it's benefited Brazil. And Lisa mentioned that a lot of these off-balance sheet financings from BNDES, there's a lot of money in the system, and not a lot of accountability for how that money's been spent. And then, so we look at where Brazil is. There's a very low investment rate, 19%. That's about the same as Belgium, which doesn't have much else in common with Brazil other than starting with a B. And the next decade, they're still going to have to qualify for, still have to meet development goals. They've been hashed out in several policy PowerPoints, as it were, by the government, but infrastructure, education, innovation, technological incorporation, driving productivity. and exports. Brazil knows what it needs to do, but it's got this path dependency on these industrial policies that are preventing it from moving forward or making it more challenging for it to move forward. So the government is realizing that this requires cooperation and coordination with the private sector, and the private sector players that they want to see are attempting to attract now do have the ability to help. And the companies that we see that are having the most success in Brazil is they've developed an understanding. As a relatively recent arrival to Brazil, you see these numerous stages of gringo denial when they come to Brazil. They say, well, this is a crazy system. This is a crazy country. Why do they do it this way? There are lots of reasons. But instead of bringing the mountain to Muhammad, it's often more effective to slightly tailor the approach for what is a unique situation. Brazil, and we have to say repeatedly, Brazil is not China. Brazil is not India. It is a different place. But there's a reason for that. I think it is that this, perhaps one of the most distinct is global supply chains. These global supply chains have been developed to be optimized to wring every ounce of productivity gain and margin out of the system. And those chains were created without Brazil in mind. They were, because they didn't get the PowerPoint on Brazil Maior when they were making them. So that's one consideration that companies who are looking to move to Brazil really have to wrestle with. Another important consideration is spillover to other jurisdictions. If I play ball with Brazil, what's the next country going to ask me to do, and will I be locked out of that country if I don't do it? Your local partner, if you have one, could export to a third country and upset your own global planning. Compliance is an issue. But on the positive side, financing, you've got a lot of financing available, and it can bring a lot of benefits, much more than just the cheap money, as it were. It qualifies you in the mind of the government as a local partner, but also it entails a commitment. A lot of industries can self-finance, but in Brazil you might not want to because of these added benefits. Human resources are the cost of productivity. Lack of productivity is a problem, and also the cost of just employing people. It requires new models, and then finally, forging local partnerships, I think, is pretty important as well. So, just to wrap it up, Brazil does have a long track record of attracting multinationals. They're there for a reason. It's been an ignored market for a long time, but it's not showing any signs of slowing down. We saw, and kind of touched on this earlier, optimizing supply chains, but in the 80s and 90s, international business went through a globalization period, and that kind of left Brazil on the sidelines, quite frankly, and now is, you see the government trying to induce a catching up period and also being met by multinationals halfway. And just to kind of sum up again, the players have realized that they need to be in Brazil. They want to be in Brazil, and if they're going to make that work, they have to adjust their structures and adapt to this unique landscape. And we see, once again, that these policy dependencies are kind of running their course, and the change will come, we think, in the next 2 to 3 years. We're going to see a liberalization, but still companies that are getting in now and present and starting to tailor those global structures will be in a strong position to benefit from these trends as they do change on a geologic time frame. So that's this kind of in a nutshell. I think hand it back.
Davis, thank you. We've got a few minutes left. Why don't we take one round of 3 questions, see if we can get it all in. And if you could identify yourself, please, by name and organization. And if the question is directed to a particular panelist, please feel free to identify who it's directed to. Otherwise, we'll assume it's for the panel. We do have circulating microphones. So to the extent that there are questions, we are open for those.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Daichi from Mizuho Bank. We are actually advising Japanese corporation. I have a question to David. We totally agree that the companies who would like to invest in Brazil have to adjust their strategy or their business operation to the government policies. At the same time, the question we receive is how sustainable that model is. I mean, nationalization has failed, I believe, in many cases in Latin America. ISI policies, there are many failures. And there are many companies that are concerned about sustainability of that model. So if you can give me some opinions about that, that would be great. Thanks.
Final question. Please.
My name is Mariko from Mizuho Bank. My question is that ceiling interest rate is expected to go higher to double digit by the end of this year. After reaching the 2 digit, what's gonna happen next? I would like to know about the interest rate.
Very good. I assume that goes to Lisa. Well, we'll direct it to her in any event. So we've got one for Davis, one for Lisa, and then I'd like to ask one for Ricardo, which is we don't have time to fully develop the whole China-Brazil relationship, but we've been reading, for example, in Reuters recently and some other news reports that Chinese interest in investment in Brazil may be waning just a little bit for various reasons. I'd like to get your perspective on that. Is that true? Well, what have you seen? And if that is indeed true, help us think through and understand why that might be. Let's go first with Davis, and then Lisa, and then we'll finish with Ricardo.
So to risks involved with participating in these industrial programs and adapting your global business models to the Brazilian reality. We see a lot of programs, whether they be PPPs or in the Brazil, there's a transfer technology-based analog called PDP, a partnership for productive development. And as Ricardo mentioned earlier, we don't see a rupture happening. And he also said in his presentation, which is extremely true and almost hard to fathom as an external observer, is that policy shifts are extremely incremental. And when we see these national policies for sectors, each subsequent policy builds, it might alter going forward the previous plan, but it doesn't throw out the agreements or the contract signed. So we have contractual certainty. If you're in one of these, if you have a deal for incentives or financing that has been signed by the government, in our experience, that is sacrosanct. That Brazil is not in a position to be attempting to attract global players and then going back on contractual obligations. There's a multiple run game, and it would only cost them in the future. And no company is really investing in Brazil for the short term. They're investing for the long term. So while there may be growing pains, I think that we don't see the risk based on legal certainty and contractual obligations and a relatively long track record of that being the case. Now, there's always issues. I don't know if there are any Norwegian pension fund managers here, but you know, we had some slight hiccups in the electricity transmission business a year ago, and the production as well, where margins were the deal for margins was basically rewritten overnight, and I think that is okay. That's unfortunate, and things do happen, and it's hard to say that if you've got $1 billion invested in the country in a specific project, but that was more of a reflection, I think, of the current president's negotiation tactics and her approach to coalition building rather than to address a real problem that was in the company, and that was more of an exception rather than the rule. So that's.
And on the Saliki, I think we're at where it's at now at 9.5. There would be, I think, general consensus. There's at least another cut this year. Then different views whether you'll have some continued, a hike. Everyone else is cutting in the region, and another increase this year to bring it to 10, and then go a bit above 10 potentially next year. and that would be more my base case at the moment. I think as you move into the election, further on into the election year, realistically, I think the idea is kind of like that, get some of the tightening in there to keep inflation below the upper limit, but you probably would have less appetite for tightening the closer you get to the election. I don't know that you would, given that inflation will remain high, and let's keep in mind, it's at, yes, it's, right under 6%, but that's high. It's high across the region. Let's not talk about Argentina and Venezuela. And service price inflation is running several percentage points higher than that in Brazil. So there's not real case to then start lowering the rate. And so I think we would be walking into the elections, staying with a double digit rate. And I think a question, I think monetary policy started to lost credibility, as I talked about fiscal credibility, monetary policy, overall policy credibility had taken a hit in Brazil. I think there are steps in place to try and gain that back. However, it's not no one's expectation, I don't think, and certainly not ours, that you're going to take the steps necessary to bring inflation back to the target of 4.5, which would yet entail additional increases in the Selic. So I think you could have a couple more increases and then tapering off. No real reason why you would think you would move into an easing mode over the next time horizon, the next year horizon.
Thank you.
Well, it's interesting to discuss foreign investment in Brazil because even though we have this very complicated domestic scenario, I think we are projecting for this year $60 billion in terms of foreign direct investment. Last year was $73 billion. Last year we were the third country to receive foreign direct investment after, I think, US and China, something. So the question is why we continue to receive so much foreign direct investment if the domestic scenario is so complicated. And I think the Chinese point, as you raised it, is part of this process. Indeed, if you take all the Latin American countries, the Chinese is entering in Brazil most recently when you compare the others. The Chinese investment was there in the other countries early in Brazil, but the Chinese is doing some investment in Brazil, mainly in automotive sector, heavy machinery sector, some electronics components sector, and more recently they was part of this group of foreign companies that bought the Libra oil reserves rights for exploration. So, but it's interesting that in the Chinese investment, foreign direct investment in Brazil is completely different from what the Brazilian government has projected in the beginning of the 2000. The Brazilian government was projecting to have the Chinese investment as a strategic partner for strategic projects like infrastructure, energy, and this kind of logistics. And actually, they didn't succeed in bringing the Chinese for this strategic investment. The Chinese was entering in Brazil for consuming sectors, basically following the path, the pattern of the other multinationals. They are looking for assessing the Brazilian domestic market in that areas, automobile, electronics, and heavy machinery, rather than try to use Brazil as a strategic partner or a strategic location for supplying Chinese necessities. And the Chinese investments, I think, as Davis presented, is following the requirements that the Brazilian regulation and the Brazilian government are demanding. So they are facing the same problems of other companies. The very interesting case was when a Chinese automobile company decided to distribute imported Chinese cars in Brazil.
And the response of not the government, but the local producers was to raise the industrial taxes for 3,000, I don't know, 3 times. So, and the Chinese strategy for entering in Brazil was disaster. And after this, they decided to invest in Brazil for a local plant in order to really reach the Brazilian market. So I think the Chinese is experiencing the same what the other foreign companies are facing.
Well, I would love to continue this conversation. Regrettably, we're at the end of our allotted time. I do hope that all 3 of you will come back, whether here to New York, to Washington, our Miami office, elsewhere around the hemisphere where we are. We would love to continue these conversations. There's so much here. And as you could tell, I was just taking notes through all 3 presentations, and I plan to go back to those and refer. I trust that you as well enjoyed the session and picked some things up. And I would ask you one more time to please join me in thanking our guests for their terrific presentation.